So my name's Kylie Dowse. I live and work in Port Macquarie in New South Wales, Australia. But today I find myself at Dulwich, at the beautiful Dulwich Centre, which sits on Kaurna land. So first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of this land where I sit. And in particular, to pay my respects to elders past, present and our emerging future. Barb Wingard has been a particular mentor for me in my work. And so it goes without saying that her influence has been particularly significant, her encouragement and her wisdom in making me a little bit braver. I think she's allowed me to access bravery. So the practice innovation that I'll be presenting today is something that's been developed with men in the Insight program that sits in the organisation I work for. And some of that work has been really challenging, it's been really difficult, and I think, you know, I don't leave myself at the door, so I'm entering into this space as a woman, as a feminist, and there's been a particularly delightful marrying of practices with narrative ways of working. So in particular, we've been looking at thwarting shame and how that's led to honouring ways that men can take responsibility in ways that aren't debilitating and in ways that certainly acknowledge and better align with women's accounts of violence towards them. So Port Macquarie, for those of you who aren't aware, is on the east coast of New South Wales. It's very much a tourist destination. It's quite popular. We've got some really beautiful beaches, but the other side of that is we've got particularly high incidence of domestic and family violence, and in particular men's violence towards women. So some of the ways we've had to create practice has been in response to that. So Biripi country is where I live and where I work, and I've had some particularly special encouragement from the elders in my community. In particular, Uncle Bill O'Brien, who has really supported me in this work. It's difficult as an Aboriginal woman. It's difficult to fully comprehend where women's business ends and men's business begins. But I work with the assurance from Uncle Bill that domestic and family violence, it's not sacred. It's a community problem that we need to address collectively. So the Herstory that sits alongside the Insight program, now the organisation that I work with was formally funded in the 1980s to respond to women who've experienced violence and abuse, and particularly to respond to children who've experienced domestic violence between their parents and the impacts it's had on them. But I do want to acknowledge that there's been decades of work prior to that commenced in women's lounge rooms. Women opened their homes to other women as an informal response, way before we were funded. So when I started working for the organisation started working for them properly, I suppose, in a paid capacity in 2000, I was certainly part of the culture there that used really totalising descriptions of men. So men who used violence were described as perpetrators. We recorded them, for short, they were perps, because perpetrator seemed a little bit long to write in case notes. They were called persons of interest in police speak. And they were the descriptions that we used were really dishonouring of any other ways that they might have liked to have lived their lives. So in 2008, we applied for substantial funding, and in that funding, part of the package was that we needed to provide responses for men who use violence. Now, it would have been really easy for us, I think, to have put that down to brokerage and referred out to psychologists and so on. But the community really supported us at that particular point in time to develop something a little bit different. So our first men's behaviour change program was delivered in 2009, and to be honest, we didn't really know what we were doing. I certainly didn't know what I was doing, so I read a lot and I talked with a lot of people, and I guess that's how sometimes, you know, practices emerge. In 2010, what's known as Justice in New South Wales now, I think at the time it might have been Department of Attorney General and Justice, started a series of consultations around what might minimum standards for programs who work with men who use violence, what might they look like? And so I was really interested in making sure that women and children's voices were prioritised in those discussions. And so as an organisation, we set about contacting our partners in other feminist organisations across the state and made sure that we were well represented at each of those consultations. So when the minimum standards were introduced in 2012, the focus, the central point of the program delivery and those minimum standards, the intention was to keep the safety of women and children at the centre of the work. So I think that our aspirations in the consultation phase were honoured. So why develop men's domestic violence behaviour change programs in the first place? As a women's organisation who, in New South Wales, we're still the only women's organisation that's funded to run programs working with men. What motivated our shift? And for us, it was our practice of listening deeply to our communities. That certainly aligns with Aboriginal practices of listening deeply, not just to words spoken and heard and written, but also to really consider what was the rhythm, what were we noticing in community, how might we respond to that. So for us, listening to the women that we worked with, some of whom didn't want the relationship to end, they wanted the violence to end, we felt a responsibility to respond to that. We also acknowledged that what we tried as Feminist Collective hadn't even made a dent in the levels of violence that women continued to experience. So the Insight program was born. So it started weekly with group sessions for 2 hours a week for 12 weeks. So what might we change in 24 hours in a person's life? So I guess I was feeling really quite pressured around that. And I was quite amazed that we started with a group of 14 men. I wasn't really prepared that any men would be prepared to stand up and say, I need a little help in my relationship. And so that was, it became really interesting because by the third week of the program, that number had dropped to 10. And in that, I thought, oh gee, this isn't going so well. Men are dropping out. Then I talked to colleagues in other programs, and they started to tell me that that was actually a really good rate, that they had much higher rates of attrition in their programs. So I thought that was encouraging. Something that I noticed was that shame really got in the way of men telling their stories where they'd enacted abuse and violence in their relationships. And I noticed a lot of blaming, that, you know, blame was being attributed to their partners. If she hadn't said this, if she hadn't done that, she knows when I'm like that, you know, she should respond in a certain way. And so that really got me thinking about the role of shame in men's behaviour change programs and in men's experience of having used violence. So I turned to the work of Alan Jenkins and attended some practice seminars and those kinds of things to really try to increase my understanding of what was this phenomenon, what was this experience of shame, to better inform how I might respond. And so to begin with, we started using Alan Jenkins' ideas of helpful and unhelpful shame, and for 3 rotations of the program we continued to try and implement that. And I really started to second guess myself and my own skill set, because I'd be met with these confused looks that what part of shame is helpful? None of this is helpful. I thought, oh, I'll try again. And then I realised that what I'd failed to do was actually listen to what men were saying. They were telling me that shame was not helpful at all. So then I thought about this idea of what if we externalised shame completely and offered it rich description, and where might I place that? And it took me all the way back to the work of Michael White, who said that in the context of externalising conversations, the problem ceases to represent the truth about people's identities, and options for successful problem resolution suddenly become visible and accessible. And what I really noticed about that, what struck me about that statement, is in none of Michael White's work has he said some people. He's talked about these methods, holding promise, I suppose, of possible positive impacts for the people we work with in addressing the problems. And so if the problem was domestic and family violence, then it seemed that this might offer a solution. So to externalise shame, I was aware that we needed to scaffold toward that. If I had walked into the group room and said, oh look, that sounds like shame's getting in the way of you telling that story, we need to externalise it, it wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense. So we started toward that. I asked, we had a group exercise, what might get in the way of talking about your role in the use of violence and abuse in your relationship? And men would put all sorts of things forward, and some of those were in response to fear of repercussion in the judicial system. But many of the men started to talk about shame. And so that offered a window in practice for me to say, oh, what if, we took this experience of shame, and what if we actually sat shame over here? And so I got another seat in our circle, and that became the place that shame sat. And we started asking questions. I'd ask, so what does shame look like? Trying to characterise and richly describe this. What interested me most about that was, and it's been recorded in other works around patriarchal discourses, that shame was always male. Shame was always very condemning, and shame told the men that if they spoke about what they'd done, that they'd be ostracised, that what they'd done was so unacceptable, so despicable, that no one would ever look at them the same way again. And then one of the men sat in the group, and he looked at shame's seat, and he said, I can still feel shame looking at me over here. And so I had this idea of what if we actually moved the seat outside of the room. So we did that, and other men agreed to that. And it was really interesting, the conversation, or the comments that were made then that were really degrading of shame, about, oh, thank God, that idiot's gone, and things like that, that deserves to be kicked out. That I kind of went home that evening thinking, what have I recreated? What have I replicated here, this condemning and disrespectful ways that were referring to shame? And so I had an idea about a support group for shame, and what might that look like. Now, Brené Brown, in one of her TED Talks, I think really eloquently described what shame's responsible for, and she says that shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. And so we started to wonder, what was shame talking about in this support group? What kinds of discussions might they have? And men held ideas that maybe all of the shames were talking with each other about missing the men, about feeling quite protective of the men and wondering how, you know, you might be telling stories and telling whole truths, in a sense, about stories of violence and abuse. And so this developed this idea that maybe shame was trying to protect men from something, and maybe it was okay for men to stand up to shame and let shame know that it's okay. I've got this. This is part of my journey, and if I prefer to be a particular way, if I prefer to bring more respect into my relationship, then in fact, shame, you're being quite unhelpful. And so that was something that we worked toward, and every now and again we would notice as a group that shame had popped in unannounced. Would stick its head in, as most of the men described, that, oh, shame's in the wrong room. And so we'd politely ask shame to go back to the support group and wonder on how it was that shame became a little bit lost. So what became possible through this practice? Some quite positive outcomes and encouraging responses from the men were that they began telling stories that aligned with women's accounts. Now this was through the women's advocates, who were working with men's partners, and in some cases former partners, were telling us stories. And this is quite a new phenomenon, that prior to that, men would tell us one story and the women's advocates would tell us quite a different story. But we noticed that there began to be a bit of an alignment between the two ways the stories were told. Other things we noticed is it created space for men to talk about feelings beyond anger more openly. We realised that men in our community have 50 ways of describing anger and different levels of anger and this nuanced anger, but we didn't really have the language to describe a whole gamut of other emotions around sadness and fear and loneliness and loss. So we noticed some shifts around language there too. Now, with men telling stories in ways that reflected women's accounts of their use of violence and abuse, in telling those stories in ways that didn't assign blame elsewhere, we noticed that it seemed to become easier for men to think about how their use of violence and abuse had harmed their partners, had harmed their children. In moving away from blame assigning stories, it opened space. There became a window for men to more fully comprehend how the violence and abuse had affected their family members and affected themselves negatively too. So in double story development, men began to talk about preferred identity in new ways, because it was like the cat was out of the bag. Pandora's box was open. There's so many other metaphors for that then made it possible for us to talk about, well, how would you prefer to be? How would you like your child at the 21st birthday to stand up and say, I'd like to thank my father for? What might the statements be that your child would make? What we noticed was that men started to talk about safety and being safe in relationships as something that was achievable. They also began to speak about respect as something that was accessible to them. Change through that became possible. And hopes and dreams for how they wanted to be viewed by their families became visible. So Gary has very generously given me permission to speak about his story. Now Gary and his partner and their children have been in contact with my organisation for a number of years now. Gary's story in terms of his interaction with the Insight program is quite interesting because he has completed the program twice. Something that really struck me with this is that he'd completed the program before the shame support group was introduced, and then he'd completed the program after it was introduced. So I was very interested to know what were the differences for him. We'd certainly noticed that his story aligned more closely with his partners, and his partner Sky spoke of feeling really relieved that Gary had owned his role in the violence and abuse, and it had been a really long time coming for her. You said that you took responsibility for what had happened without blaming Sky. Can you retell me that story? Because I missed it on the tape before.
Well, without blaming Sky, I've seen it, and without blaming her this time, every time I apologised and said, oh, I'm sorry for doing that, but always I have to say, but you said this and this, that's why I acted like that. It just actually took
Seems
full
really
responsibility.
significant.
It was full. I actually felt the full responsibility of it. Didn't try to question it. Didn't try to pass the blame. It was all me. She didn't deserve any of it.
And so was that a new thing?
Yeah.
So we noticed in Gary's telling, even in Gary's telling of that he was able to talk about his use of violence and abuse with Sky in a way that relieved him not of responsibility, but relieved him of shame. And you can see the differences in that he was able to talk about feeling responsible in a way that didn't cause his shoulders to slump, and there's not been any ideas of I'm hopeless, I'm helpless, I'm a terrible man, but in ways that actually support construction of preferred identity. So to summarise, externalising shame and providing it with its own support group supported men to talk about the problem of using violence and abuse in relationship quite differently. It also offered space to validate the experience of the people who'd experienced the abuse. It enabled responsibility to be viewed from a different vantage point, so men were able to stand in territories that were safe enough for them to say unequivocally, I did this thing. It's not a total description of who I am, but I did do this thing, I made a mistake, and this is how I would prefer to be. So I hope that you might be able to use some of these ideas in your practice, and I look forward to hearing about them. If you would like to get in contact with me, I'll provide my email address as part of this presentation. But I'd certainly like to have further conversations with other people who are working with men who've used violence and abuse in the context of narrative practices. So thank you.